Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called, what's it going to be called? It's going to be called 20 90s artists that make today's music look terrible, or something like that. I'm going to try and shorten it if I can. I've just done a video where I've talked about the sort of American end and looked at some incredible American artists and where the influences come from. And this is a real, whistle-stop tour, because there are so many artists. There's so many artists I've missed. So let's look at the British scene now. So one of the things that's interesting with the British scene is how in this country we took up American house music and dance music, techno. So in America, that was really was sort of an extension of disco music. Dance music emerged in the 80s in warehouses, and people went there to dance. And there was sort of a revolution, and that revolution was brought back by samplers and sequencers, because suddenly you didn't need a band to make a disco record. A guy could be making it in his sort of little home studio. A lot of the artists that were emerging were quite anonymous. Nobody knew what they looked like. The music was coming out on white labels. DJs were the vessel rather than touring. And this is a little revolution. When it comes to the UK, it sort of combines with a sort of almost like revolutionary fervour. And you have that whole New Age Travellers music, and you have this whole illegal festival. So in the UK, what you had was people started putting on illegal raves in fields, and DJs would go and play house music, and this created a countercultural sort of movement, which I feel doesn't get mentioned that much. It's I think it was greater than punk. Punk was a few minutes really in 1976 when that happened, but this went on and really changed. People were the government was trying to enact laws. And that creates a whole counter movement. And through that, a whole bunch of artists came out that I sort of classed as being extensions of electronic dance music, house, jungle, rave, all that type of stuff. Right? And I want to really start with talking about that band. So the first guy I pulled out is Ronnie Size. This album, Represent New Forms. Okay? So Ronnie Size had come out of the jungle scene. He was originally creating white labels, and people were playing them out, in clubs, and people were going nuts to them. Ronnie Size and Goldie, and I nearly pulled his album out as well, the Timeless album, really influenced by jazz and prog and extended music, created these two, which I think are almost like progressive rock albums. This is a double album with long tracks. It features jazz musicians, real instrumentation. This is an incredible change in music. And this was mainstream. I can remember, I heard about this because I put the TV on one night, and it was a concert by Ronnie Size. And there was Clive Deamer on drums, they had a double bass player, and they were playing what sounded like twisted jazz with electronica, very hypnotic, very fast. And I was really, really influenced by this. Later on, when I was playing with Robert Plant, I got replaced by Clive Deamer, and he was coming down to a lot of the gigs. Little did I know that I would be gone, and Clive would come in and replace me playing for Robert Plant. But it was an incredible, opportunity to actually sit down with Clive and question him, an incredible drummer that played such an important part in 90s music. He's going to crop up later on as well. So yeah, this movement emerges, bands like this. And that starts to influence, in the UK, a lot of what we would call indie artists. So, originally the singer of the Sugar Cubes, Bjork. This is an incredible album. Incredible debut, called Debut by Bjork. And then Bjork just goes further down the line with every album, just going heavier and deeper, very influenced by the electronica that's coming out of that electronic dance music scene. She's a mainstream artist, she's having huge hit records. But if you go and check the albums out, there's heaviness going on. The album after this, Post, is even heavier, even more way out. And the album after that, Homogenic, is even more incredible than that. What an artist this person is. This is one of the greats, making very very, I would say, experimental music, but also hit records. In the UK, coming out of this sort of dance music and electronica, but also mixed with hip hop, was a genre called trip hop. Now, trip hop is actually going to go on and carry on and merge with house music and garage. It's eventually going to then turn into speed garage, which is going to turn into two-step, which is going to turn then in terms of dubstep, which is then going to turn into sort of the sort of trap, and a lot of the music forms that are here today. And these bands were very important and hugely successful. And the first one I pulled out is Massive Attack. Incredible band here. This is coming out of Bristol, as is Tricky. And as well, I'll just grab it. Portishead with the aforementioned Clive Deamer on drums. This is incredible movement for me. And one of the big changes for me listening to these bands was how they changed production. You know, that up until then, I think production had really been seen as having certain aesthetic qualities. And then, especially Portishead, they were almost like anti-production. You know, hissy, muffly, you know, compressed and dark. And when I first heard Portishead, it really sounded like Bristol, the town where they came from. You could almost hear the sort of dark, you know, it's a port town, and you could sort of hear misty fog rolling in from the sea when you hear that stuff. These three artists, Portishead, Tricky, and Massive Attack, huge influences. On the other side of that, we've also got a movement called electronica coming out, with groups like Aphex Twin, Square Pusher. This is really incredible music, and I've actually pulled out a single. I don't think this was a hit record, and I don't think this group actually had a hit record like the other groups we're talking about. Like that, for example, there's Massive Attack's, this is the single for Rising Sun. You know, so this stuff was getting put out as singles, and tracks like Teardrops were huge MTV hits. But under that, and I did want to represent it, was electronica. Now I can remember watching Aphex Twin on MTV. This was popular music, but it was incredible. I pulled out Photek and this single, which I'm not going to pronounce the title of it. Shall I try? Ni Ten Ichi. and then on the B-side, Fifth Column. This whole electronica aesthetic is very interesting. It's like, I don't know whether people do it now. The computers have become so ubiquitous that all music now is electronica in reality. But these electronica bands were exploring the very process of creating music digitally. You know, in many cases, making music out of the digital process. So the way that you could cut up a drum beat, they would cut it up to such a speed that when you heard it, that would turn into a note, and they would use glitches and white noise. This is an incredible period for music, which is still having an effect now. But on the other side of that, you also suddenly had groups that were putting all this together. They were putting the dance music together, the electronic experimentation, the whole trip hop thing, which was slowly turning into a thing called big beat. A whole bunch of groups came out of that. Fatboy Slim would be one. Bentley Rhythm Ace with my friend Richard March, you know, that was an incredible band. I pulled out a couple of albums that I absolutely loved that were huge influence on me. One is the Chemical Brothers' Dig Your Own Hole, which is just a massive psychedelic mash of excitement and noise, you know. I can remember being in London in Tower Records, flicking through the jazz section, and Block Rocking Beats had just come out as a single, so they were playing it, and I heard that slap bass line come in, and then the drums come in. I couldn't tell whether it was real or not real. I think it sounded real to me, but it did sounded incredible, you know, like some weather 42 on speed. It was just, not weather, I say weather, level 42 on speed, and I just couldn't believe it. And I bought that single there and then, got home, went and bought this album. You know, it has on here the hit single "Setting Sun," which they did with Noel Gallagher from Oasis. It's got to be Noel's finest hour. Anyone going to disagree with that? Another group that I thought absolutely fantastic, Propellerheads. This has got a lot more of that sort of 60s vibe, that sort of 60s fusion vibe almost, a bit of Burt Bacharach in there, you know, a little bit of electronica in there, almost like Kraftwerk at certain points. And who are they? Who are these guys? Look at it blowing up, and these two silhouettes. These people are faceless. They're bands, but they're faceless. This music is going to influence the indie scene in the UK, and we could see a group like Oasis as almost being somewhere between that rave mentality mixed with a sort of indie rock approach, and Oasis are much closer to indie rock, but they're nothing like an indie rock band. This element sort of comes out of groups like Pot Will Eat Itself. It comes out of groups like EMF. Now I know the guys in these bands. You know, I this is my era, and I was so close to it that I now know the guys in these bands, and it was sort of punky rock guys that in many cases had a little bit of an ear towards prog, but hitting dance music and electronic music. And Britpop, I feel, has its roots in those bands, you know. Where I live in the Midlands, you know, I'm just literally 5 miles away from Stourbridge, where we have the whole Stourbridge scene. Bands like The Wonder Stuff and Ned's Atomic Dustbin and Pot Will Eat Itself. And I know the people in these bands, and that they don't get the credit but to be in the forerunner for so much music. I can see Ned's Atomic Dustbin has almost been the forerunner of pop punk. But a lot of these bands are also the forerunners of what got called Britpop. And I've mentioned Oasis, but of course my favourites were Blur. And Blur was so much more than just a Britpop band. And they covered so many different areas. From, you know, song 2 is almost like grunge, isn't it? You know, if you think of Park Life, that's the beginning of UK hip hop. There it is. They probably got it from Ian Jury, and I know that because I had encounters when I was younger with the Streets, and I nearly worked with the Streets. I didn't quite happen, but I knew the guys, and I spoke to them, and they basically got the idea, which is the idea for UK hip hop is from Blur. But what a, you know, song 2 and Park Life, you know, with Coffee and TV in the middle. That it's an incredible scope. What a band! And this is a real mainstream pop band. Do we have bands like this? And now I'm going to finish with a band UK band that's come out of the grunge scene. Has got a whole ton of indie music. They redo the rules for, you know, indie rock. Then they come out with a run of albums that move towards electronica. I pulled out my favourite album. I was going to pull out OK Computer by, of course, Radiohead, but instead I pulled out this one. Amnesiac, which has Pyramid Song. Pyramid Song to me just encompasses everything I've been talking about on these last 2 videos. That's the single. That's a hit record, Pyramid Song. It's absolutely bizarre. It manages to have punk elements in it, hip hop elements, modern classical elements, fusion elements, prog elements, electronica elements. It spans everything, and by being that, it's a thing unto itself, entirely individual, and in its way it seems to come out of absolutely nowhere. This album, which is the last one I picked, I'm pretty sure came out in '99, right at the end of that decade. I think at 99 everything seems to change, and we've discussed this in the comments on this channel when I've talked about this elsewhere, but this is a sudden shift, and for me it's marked by the release of Hit Me Baby One More Time by Britney Spears. When that single came out, I can remember there was a big hoo-ha about it, and it just goes straight in at #1, and it was like suddenly the music world had gone, oh, this is exciting, this is fresh, and what it was out and out pop music. This to me is very similar to the switch that happens at the end of the 70s when punk comes out. Punk initializes this change, okay, but what punk actually creates is not really punk in the 80s. There's no such thing as punk in the 80s. The indie bands that come out in the 80s that sort of get labelled post-punk, you know, like Joy Division and then The Cure and then the Smiths, that has nothing to do with punk, right? They're drawing influences from elsewhere. They really are. But punk started that off. But I think punk's influence far more was on popular music, because punk was direct and it pulled everything in. And so musicians that had come through that sort of 70s progressive rock sort of background then pulled everything in. And when we saw bands like Genesis or Yes or Asia pull in what they did, suddenly they have hit records. Throughout the 90s, you have all those boy bands coming through. At the same time, I think the whole boy band thing to me at the time was just, you've got serious pop bands, you know, like Blur, like Radiohead, like Nirvana. These are all pop bands. These are we're talking about these bands because they had hit records. You know, you've got to remember this. But in 1999, it's as though not just the industry but the world discovered pop music, and suddenly you had Britney Spears, and then you had Christina Aguilera, and then you had Justin Timberlake, who I love. Justified is one of my favourite albums. Shh, don't tell anybody, really. It is. I think it's great because I love pop music. But I think that pop music explosion happened to be around when we had the digital technological explosion, and I've discussed this here a lot, and it always comes down to a chicken and egg argument. You know, what did come first? Is it the technology, you know, changing the culture, or is it the culture changing the technology? The truth is, I think that what's happening is it's all happening at the same time, so it's holding hands. And I think what happened with digital technology, to put it simply, is pop music, you know, songs with immediate hooks, where actually the listening experience isn't so important, that are short and concise work better, especially when you have that early file sharing period, you know, so people can grab tracks. The visuals become so much more important, as we know. MTV had already pushed this, you know, and a lot of these groups I've covered in this video were very clever in making quite outlandish art videos. You know, the videos were as important as the music. You know, if you think of, say, Teardrops by Massive Attack, and then you imagine that video with the baby in the womb singing, that's an incredible video. But it's different to Britney Spears, you know, in her school uniform singing Hit Me Baby One More Time, you know, with a dance routine. That's something else that I think, as YouTube has kicked in, that's become even more important. It's almost impossible to now break an artist on the song alone. It's totally about the visuals. Whether it's within the scope to explore that, the question is, and I'm just going to pose it at the end of this now, is this music better than the music we have today? Right, I'm going to answer that on a video, but it's going to be over on my Patreon site. So I'm going to switch off now and I'm going to go, and if you like this video, like and subscribe and stuff, and if you want to really hear me discussing this, then pop over to Patreon, pay your money, and you can see me discuss whether this music is better or not. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video.